This is a video for Scholar Strike 2020 about the dangers of performative allyship. I'm Professor Joanne Lipson-Freed. I'm an associate professor of English at Oakland University. So this video is going to take a few minutes to think about allyship and what does it look like to be an ally. This word circulates a lot and it's worth paying a little critical attention to it. The question of what it looks like to be an ally is really important for me as a white professor who teaches and studies U.S. multi-ethnic literature. And a part of my responsibility as a white person is to work with other white people to recognize and challenge anti-Blackness, including in ourselves. So for this video, I'm going to use the movie Get Out, directed by Jordan Peele, as a kind of an example to think a little bit about allyship. So if you have not seen the movie, this video does contain spoilers, and I would strongly encourage you to skip this video for now, go watch the movie, and maybe you can circle back around and take a listen to this at another time. So, one of the central dynamics in the film is the relationship between the main character, Chris, who is Black, and his girlfriend, Rose, who is white. And the film begins with them preparing to take a visit home to meet her parents. And Chris having a kind of awkward but important conversation with her about whether or not her family is going to be comfortable with the fact that she is dating someone who is Black. Chris totally understands that Rose in this moment has had the luxury of not having to worry about whether her family would be a safe place for someone like Chris. And of course, she insists that it's not a problem. She says, my dad would have voted for Obama a third time if he could have, which is kind of a funny kind of way of announcing one's non-racist credentials. But I think just this scenario with which the movie opens is already a reminder that Chris sees risks from his perspective that Rose, by virtue of her perspective, has not had to think very much about. And of course, once we reach the end of the film, we realize that Rose is in fact not at all the sort of progressive white woman that she makes herself out to be in the beginning, but in fact a sort of a stone cold sociopathic participant in her family's racist lobotomy cult. And that's part of the scenario that makes this a horror movie. But I want to circle back to the beginning of the movie. Before Rose's role in her family's violent lobotomy operation is something that readers become, or excuse me, viewers of the movie become aware of, right? While we still look at Rose as a typical, well-meaning white ally for her Black boyfriend, Chris. And I think that that's one of the most powerful things that a movie like Get Out is able to accomplish, is that it's got this whole sort of horror scenario. But in fact, some of the most chilling moments in the film are not the ones that are related to the more heightened or unbelievable parts of the horror genre, but actually these representations of daily interactions that we could recognize in our own experiences. So, I want to look for a minute at the deer strike scene early in the movie when Rose and Chris are on their way to her parents' house. If you can remember the scene, one of the most notable things about it is the way that Rose escalates this encounter with the police by really pressing the issue of whether it's appropriate for the officer to ask Chris for his identification, even though they've done nothing wrong and Chris was not driving the car. In the scene, we see Chris repeatedly trying to de-escalate the situation by complying with the officer, and Rose sort of belligerently making the point that the officer is profiling Chris. And Rose is not wrong about this, right? She's absolutely right in that the officer is acting in a biased way, and that he does not have any basis for asking Chris to produce his ID. But her insisting on this point in the way that she does clearly puts Chris at risk. And this is something that in this scene, the movie does a really good job of showing us that he recognizes and she does not. Right? So even if Rose were not the sort of sociopath that she's ultimately revealed to be, even if she were sincerely trying to be an ally in this moment, what she's doing in this scene would be dangerous for Chris. And I think that's something really important to think about. So, what can we learn from this episode in the film? A couple of important things, I'd say. One is that racial harm does not necessarily have to look like this. Rose pointing a gun, right? Racial harm can and often does look a lot less overtly threatening. And that's part of what it means to live in a pervasively white supremacist society, right? That we do not need to, and I say we, right? I'm speaking from my position as a white person, that white people don't have to necessarily do something as overt as what this picture would suggest to endanger Black people, even Black people who we care about and aspire to support and affirm. I think another thing that this scene teaches us, if we look at it with a kind of critical and self-reflexive eye, is the way that if you are a white person, it can feel really good to call out another white person for their racism, right? To both try to correct what you recognize is an injustice, but also at the same time position yourself in the right, and very visibly so. And that's kind of what I mean by calling this performative allyship in the title of this video. The kind of allyship that makes sure that everyone knows just exactly how woke you are. Being an ally, or I think better to use the language that Bettina Love, among others, advocates for, to be a co-conspirator, is not to be an ally in the way that Rose is, where her performance of allyship is front and center. Rather, it places the needs of Black people first. So Bettina Love writes, co-conspirators understand how whiteness and privilege work in our society and leverage their power, privilege, and resources in solidarity with justice movements to dismantle white supremacy. So, a couple of takeaways from this video. If you are a white person, here are some ways that you can check yourself when you're thinking about your own practices of racial allyship. Ask yourself, is my allyship in this moment about my needs or about the way that I'd like to be perceived by others? If so, maybe take a moment and think about how you can decenter yourself in the work of anti-racism. Ask yourself, what kinds of privilege or safety do I possess in this moment precisely because I am white? What do I have the luxury to take for granted? In the scene in Get Out, Rose has the luxury to take her own safety in an interaction with a police officer for granted, right? She perhaps does not even see the way that the same situation she is in is dangerous to Chris precisely because he is not white, right? So reflecting, cultivating that critical self-awareness, what have I had the luxury of overlooking from the position that I occupy? And last but not least, how can I use my privilege in support of Black liberation? I think that really gets to the quote from Bettina Love that I shared just a second ago, right? That one of the most valuable things that you can do as a white person is to understand not just that you have privilege, but how you can use it intentionally and responsively in support of Black people and Black liberation.